I'm Mike Ross. Here's a segment from our show live from Studio 5 that airs weekdays from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern on AMI Audio.
Fareed Khan is a resident of Gatineau, Quebec, who sponsored a petition calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to take decisive action to help the Rohingya people. He presented his petition to Parliament in a media conference on Tuesday, October 17th, in the center block of the Parliament buildings. Fareed Khan is a government relations and communications consultant and a social justice activist who is the sponsor of the petition and joins us from the nation's capital region right now. Mr. Khan, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Before we get into talking about the petition, this issue has received a lot of coverage, but can you give us an idea of what the plight of the Rohingya people is, and how is it that we have gotten to this point?
Yes, well, I'm sure for those of your listeners who have been following this, it's received quite a bit of coverage recently. But it's not a new issue. The Rohingya are an ethnic minority from Myanmar, formerly Burma. They represent less than 1.9% of the total population of that country. And for decades they've been persecuted by the Myanmar government. In 1982, the government stripped them of their citizenship, essentially making them stateless. And they've done everything possible to try and marginalize this community. They are not allowed to work in any areas that are related to government, so they can't work as civil servants. They can't work in hospitals or as teachers. They've been totally marginalized, and basically what's been happening up until most recently, there was the strategy was to ethnically cleanse them from Myanmar, but more recently, starting late August, the government forces took it a step further and started committing crimes against humanity, and what a lot of people are calling genocide. And the result has been that in order to flee the violence and save their lives, the Rohingya have fled to neighboring Bangladesh, creating one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. There's only, before this most recent outbreak of violence against them, there were about 1.1 million Rohingya in Myanmar. Now about almost 600,000 of them have fled to neighboring Bangladesh. And those are the ones who survived. There were thousands who were killed by Myanmar forces, and didn't matter, women, children, babies. Their villages were burnt to the ground so that they couldn't return, and we have the situation that we have today. And so anyway, I've been following this issue for years, and always wondered why no one was doing something. And finally, I felt like I need to do something more than I'd been doing in the past, so I started this petition. And thank you, to all the people who signed it. There was over 44,000 now, as of a couple of days ago. So signed this petition calling on the government to take action, and we are where we are today. So I presented this petition on Tuesday, and now I'm trying to follow up to see where the government is going to go with this, because our own government has been very tepid in its response to this crisis.
What kind of feedback had you received, and have you received from other parliamentarians outside of the government since you put your petition forward? Well,
there was parliamentarians from each of the parties at the presentation of the petition on Tuesday. The opposition parliamentarians, there were two NDP members, a member from the Conservative House caucus in the House, as well as a Conservative senator, and all of them spoke very strongly about this issue and how Canada needed to act. The Liberal member who was there, who I've actually been working with to try and move this forward, her response was, I can only say, underwhelming. She's a good woman. She's an MP from Montreal, and she's been very helpful, but I don't know that, that she must have received orders from on high about how strong her response could be, because all of us who've been working on this felt that her response, or what she said, was not strong enough compared to the other people who spoke.
What about the response from the United Nations? Because from what I've gathered to this point, there's been a reluctance to come out and say the words ethnic cleansing and genocide by the United Nations as a whole. Is that concerning?
Well, the United Nations actually has come out and called it a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. I believe it was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. I believe it was he was the one who said that this is a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. And you're correct in saying that they haven't said it's genocide. My understanding is that from a lot of the reading and I've been doing and the people I've spoken with is that the reason for that is that if they use specifically the term genocide, if that is used by UN officials, then and it's labeled a genocide, then that sort of kickstarts an automatic series of decisions that have to be made, and that's one of the reasons why they're not doing it. The thing is, though, that who cares? As far as I'm concerned, who cares if that's what happens? Because people are dying while politicians and diplomats are sitting around talking. So if you want to call it, if it's a genocide, which is I think a lot of people think that it is, then call it that, and let's start taking action to help these people.
Right, and while politicians talk and debate and figure out what to call it, you've got a petition that has now received over 44,000 signatures. Can you tell us what some of the demands were? I believe there were about 5. So what is it that your petition touches on?
Okay, there were, yes, you're right, there were 5 demands. One is symbolic, and the other 4 are very specific, concrete actions. The symbolic action was to revoke the honorary citizenship that Canada gave to Aung San Suu Kyi, the Myanmar leader, for her complicity in crimes against humanity and genocide. And that's there because it caught a lot of attention and because we had that connection. So we can't have someone who has that honor holding, the honor of a Canadian citizenship with people like Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, Malala Yousafzai. She doesn't belong in that company. So that's number 1. Number 2 is to unequivocally condemn the atrocities committed by Myanmar's military and state-supported nationalist groups who have committed crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide against the Rohingya minority, and work with international partners to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice. Third is to take leadership for Canada, to take leadership at the UN and on the international stage, to impose an arms embargo on Myanmar in conjunction with international partners. Fourth, to work with international agencies and our allies to create a safe haven for the Rohingya in their homeland under the United Nations Protocol of Responsibility to Protect. And finally, to work with the UN High Commission for Refugees and leaders of other nations to address the humanitarian crisis which is happening in neighboring Bangladesh, and make sure that those Rohingya who are living in refugee camps who choose to settle in other countries are able to do so without difficulty. So those are the 5 calls in the petition.
Given what you've put forward here, not how hopeful, but how confident are you that you may get some positive reaction here from the government and action on these 5 points?
At this point, I am getting frustrated because I started this petition in early September. The government is totally aware of the support that it's received. As I said, I've been working with government MPs to get this, to have action happen on this petition. And unfortunately, the Prime Minister his response and his comment on this have been very lukewarm. I can only hope that he would shed tears for the babies and children and being killed and the women being gang raped the way he did for his response to the death of Gord Downey, the frontman for the Tragically Hip. The people who are calling on the government to take action, this is not, we're not lobbying for, benefits, tax benefits for a business, or we're not lobbying to get money from the government for, some local project. We're talking about saving lives. And the fact that the government has not responded with, greater intensity, with greater strength and determination on this is really very disturbing. I'd just like to mention one thing your listeners may not be aware of, but a few weeks ago, there was a Holocaust memorial dedicated here in Ottawa.
Yeah.
And the Prime Minister was at that dedication, and when he spoke about Canada's commitment to defending or to opposing discrimination, xenophobia, and racism and bigotry. And, in the memory of the people who were killed, that Holocaust memorial is dedicated to. Well, if we're not acting to help the Rohingya right now, when the same sort of thing is happening to them as happened to the Jews in World War II in Nazi Germany, then his words are meaningless, and that Holocaust memorial has lost its meaning. So, I have put it to the in my media conference. I put it to the Prime Minister. Does he have a commitment to those values of opposing racism and bigotry and hatred, or are those just words? And I say that again.
Well, they didn't even put the word Jews on the monument. I mean, if that doesn't speak to oversight and somebody dropping the ball somewhere, I don't know what does. It's live from Studio 5 on AMI Audio. Mike Ross and Joita Gupta along with Fareed Khan. He's a government relations and communications consultant and social justice activist and the sponsor of a petition that is calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to take decisive action to help the Rohingya people. And he's joining us this morning from the nation's capital area. What about businesses around the world? What kind of pressure is being brought by businesses who do business in Myanmar? And are they doing enough? And should more pressure be applied to those businesses by their customers?
Well, I definitely think that businesses could be doing a lot more, but I think right now everything is at the stage of diplomacy and politics. And until decisions are made in that arena, the role that businesses can play, has to wait. Because if decisions were made on a diplomatic level, on the political level, then basically governments could then start putting in place regulations and laws about trading with the Myanmar military. For example, the arms embargo. You could put in place an embargo. And that would definitely, call on those companies that are selling arms to basically halt doing business with the government. The other thing that one can think of when you think about business dealings with the forces in that country are those businesses that deal directly with the government and deal directly with the military. So, put pressure on them to halt business, put pressure on, for example, airlines that carry these officials on their trips out of the country, put in place restrictions on the movement of the leaders of Myanmar. So there's a lot of things that can be done by business, but the thing is that a full-on economic boycott is not something that you want to be doing at this point, because what it'll do is it'll affect the people on the ground, not just the Rohingya, but others in Myanmar. And that would harden the attitudes of the population on this issue. It's bad enough as it is right now, but it will become worse. So right now, the call is to focus on those sorts of actions that are going to directly affect the people who are responsible for committing the atrocities, the military leaders, the political leaders.
And you've called for a need for greater diplomatic action and for Canada to really step up to the plate. What are some of the next steps that you have in mind?
Well, right now I've been after the presentation last week, I've been in touch with the MPs and the senator that were there. I've asked to appear before the Human Rights Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee of both the Senate and the House of Commons to further speak about the petition. I'm also going to be trying to speak with them about the possibility of opposition MPs actually presenting a motion in Parliament to take action on the one thing that Canada on its own can do, and that is to revoke the honorary citizenship. The citizenship, when it was granted to Aung San Suu Kyi, was done so with through a motion in the House with all-party support. I think that given what's happened, we can at least take one action, and if that were to take place, it would send a very strong signal to the world about where Canada stands on her complicity in this whole tragedy that's going on.
When you look at the current climate in the world. When we talk about the political climate, political discourse, and a time when some people, are very comfortable in demonstrating a lack of tolerance or a lack of welcoming refugees and immigrants to North America. How much do you think that feeds into the lack of knowledge of this situation, or in some cases, just a complete lack of empathy or sympathy?
I'm sure that has a part to play in it, but I think a lot of it, probably the attitudes, the public attitudes on this issue, a lot of it has to do probably with the sort of world we live in today with respect to information. We are a plugged-in society. We are bombarded with information every day, and I think that for a lot of people, they have to decide what they want to, what sort of information they want to absorb and what they don't. I think we're so plugged in that people are overwhelmed with all the information that's being thrown their way. In terms of attitudes that towards crises overseas or minority groups within our own society, there is obviously a rising wave of xenophobia and bigotry that is happening in all Western nations. We see it on the news regularly, but those are a minority. I think if you've looked at surveys that and polls, generally people, at least Canadians, are very tolerant and accepting. I think an example is the way that Canada reacted to the whole refugee situation with the Syrians. Canadians opened their homes and their hearts and welcomed the action by the Canadian government to allow Syrian refugees into Canada. In the case of the Rohingya, we aren't calling for Canada to open its doors to another huge wave of refugees, although I'm sure there are some Rohingya who could arrive in Canada as refugees. Nothing like what happened with the Syrians, but in much smaller numbers. But what we are calling for instead is for Canada to take decisive action internationally and through our own means here in Canada to not only make a solid statement on helping the Rohingya, but also calling on the international community to live up to its responsibility to protect a persecuted minority, what the UN has called the most persecuted minority in the world. So if we as a nation that believes in freedom and democracy and upholding human rights, if we can't stand up for a voiceless people who are called the most persecuted minority in the world, then our politicians and leaders should stop talking about the values of Canada, because it means that we're being hypocrites. And I don't think Canadians want our country to be seen as hypocrites when it comes to defending human rights, whether that's here in Canada or anywhere in the world.
Mr. Khan, thank you very much for spending some time with us here today. We wish you all the best. The federal government can be a bit of a moving target these days, and they're juggling a lot of things, and I'm sure it's hard to sort of nail them down on something like this, but we appreciate you spending some time with us, telling us about it, and wish you luck moving forward.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'd be happy to update you in the future as this moves forward.
We'd appreciate that. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to Live from Studio 5. Make sure to subscribe to Live from Studio 5 wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating and review.